Story 1. I used to be fearless. I used to be fearless. Horror movies never really scared me. Scary books had no effect. Haunted houses are me. Aimless, I was never a child who slept with the covers over their face or with a night light. As a little girl, I never felt the need to crawl into bed with my mother after having a nightmare. I never really had nightmares to begin with, and the few that I did, most would never consider a nightmare at all. I've simply never been afraid of what goes bump in the night. Our home security system kept away fears of very real humans with dark intentions, as did our Rottweiler, aptly named Killer. As for threats outside the home, well, who could be afraid in a nice, white a class community? I've lived in a bland bubble all my life, never knowing what fear is. So why should I ever be afraid of the dark? Up until this moment, I haven't been. I saw it as childish and illogical. Of course, I don't feel that way anymore. I'm writing this to you now as a warning because it's too late for me. I know that now, and it's brought on a surreal sort of calm. When I finish warning you, it will be all over. So forgive me if I'm being long-winded. I enjoy life a bit more than I was once willing to admit. It all started with what I thought was a virus. I had been linked to a video called Girls and Boys Come Out to Play. It sounded harmless enough. I thought it was an art student's film, perhaps. The person who had linked the video promised it was why good, well worth watching. I can't remember the video. All I can remember is the feeling it brought up. It wasn't fear, but it was close. I was uncomfortable. I was unnerved. I was also vaguely ill. From then on, things only got worse. The background on my computer had changed to a picture of a disturbed-looking young woman who stared at me from a black abyss every now and then, and growing more frequent by the day. Strange noises would emit from my computer even when the sound wasn't on. Screaming, strange laughter, grinding noses. At the time, I was annoyed. The fear hadn't settled in quite yet. Then the faces started popping up, like those ridiculous screamers that scared my friends in high school. Yet these were different. They looked real. They were the faces of the dead, and they had died. Violent deaths. I wish I could say that I stopped using the computer, but I couldn't. My job requires me to use my computer frequently. What was I to do? I had no other computer available to me. I tried to take it in to have the virus removed, but no one could help me. They said there wasn't a virus. They said the computer was fine. Meanwhile, it got worse. The faces weren't just popping up. They would stay, and with those horrible, rotted eyes, they would hold my gaze. I couldn't look away from them and their terrible, mocking grins, and oh, God, the smell. My computer forever had a vague stench of death around it. I thought I was going crazy. I thought that perhaps someone was messing with me. The people at the computer your place didn't know what they were talking about. Something was wrong, but I knew that it had to be something very real that just had to be fixed. So I got a new computer. Everything was fee-penny for a while, but then it all came back, and in full force. Now there were voices. Now there was screaming. Now the rotted faces showed their stinking bodies. I could see every maggot, very fly, every pus-filled crevice, and they were calling to me, telling me that soon, very soon, I'd be joining them. They were so angry that I had tried to get rid of them, and now they would make me pay. I didn't know what to do. Ignoring the problem wasn't working. I thought maybe it was the fault of a friend from work. Perhaps it came from the emails they had been sending me. I never thought it was the video. Not for a second, after all. That just wasn't logical. I was at the end of my rope. Today I unplugged the computer and began packing. I would go on vacation, clear my head, and pray that everything would be back to normal. A few minutes ago, I realized it would not. The power went out, and for the first time in my life, I felt true fear. I had no idea that in a few moments it would become mind-numbing. I stumbled through the house looking for a flashlight when I saw that something was still giving off light. The unplugged computer was on, and the woman in the background was moving, beckoning me over. I couldn't help myself. I sat down across from her with the darkness caving in all around me, and then the woman, like all of the other images I've seen before, began to rot away. The whole scene rotted away, and then the screen went black. And without light, without a means of seeing my reflecting on, I saw her behind me for the briefest of moments, a bloody and rusted knife in hand. The computer came back to life, and my old background had returned. But I know it's not over, so I've decided to come here. I know you all like to be scared, right? Well, take it from someone who has only very recently known fear. It's not always worth it, and not everything is fun and games. Of course, you probably won't believe me. Why should you? The thing is, I haven't been completely honest with you. There was no video. It was a story quite similar to this one, though with subtle plot differences and perhaps better storytelling. I know all of you like stories that might give you a good scare. That's probably why you started reading mine. Now that you've read this, you share my fate. I know it's cruel and perhaps unfair, but it has to be done. I just hope that you can take comfort in knowing that when I'm the woman haunting your computer, I'll be a bit more gentle. If I can, I'll use a blade that's a little less dull. Pictures of those who came before us who are a little less grotesque. Sounds that are a little less alarming. But then again, you do like to be scared, right? Don't worry, I won't ask you to repost this story 5 times. Nothing will save you. After all, nothing could save me. The power is still out. And I know, behind me, the W. Oman is waiting for me. I'll see you very soon. Goodbye for now. Story 2. Lanterns. Mark's head rocked wildly in the pillow as a muted moan popped from his throat. His eyeballs thrashed off. Out under clenched lids, kamikaze fireflies trapped in a skin jar. He jerked awake, and his first sight was the glowing bulb of his bedside lamp. It lit the room in a pale imitation of daylight, and he was grateful. He glanced over at the next futon. Wife Sen lay there breathing regularly, apparently undisturbed. Her face seemed somehow strange, unfamiliar, but when he rubbed his eyes, everything was fine. Wiping his forehead with the back of one hand, he examined his sheets and pajamas with the other. They were all drenched in sweat, and the book he'd been reading as he drifted off was wedged under the small of his back. Maybe he shouldn't have started it. Sure, it was full of trite, mostly laughable true stories of alleged hauntings. But one of the tales in it had really creeped him out. A little girl and her mother lived together in an old house in a small town. There was the usual stuff about disembodied footsteps, doors opening by themselves, and voices calling in the night. But one of the manifestations was a bit unusual and had given him a case of the heebie-jeebies. The little girl had told her mother of a triangle-headed man who occasionally peered into her room at night from the closet. The phrase triangle-headed man had opened up bizarre geometrical perspectives for the human face and head, making Mark's men wonder in lurid curiosity. After reading that passage, he had snapped the book shut and gazed up through his window, seeing an alien, bitter man with a triangle-shaped head and every dark clod a guy, and he glanced over at wife San, her face sweet in repose. He clicked off the lamp, but the moon lit the room quite well all the same. A sudden sensation of being lost among dark mountains overtook him. He was traversing a mountain path, could feel the hard ground beneath his feet as he gently ascended a slope. Up and up he went, the moon lighting his way. It felt good he'd be eager, thinking of the famous landmark, Bacatoro. Was it near here? No, it was in the mountains just to the west of Nico's city, an area of sacred shrines and relics. There one could find Bacatoro, a large copper lantern located in the grounds of Futarasan Shrine, which sat atop the sacred mountain of Nantai. In ancient times, the people of Nico revered Mount Nantai as a gathering place for the gods and devils of the mountains. The lantern itself was traditionally believed to change into a demon when lit, and its 10 sword marks from the blades of samurai attested to the power of this belief. He imagined climbing that mountain, reaching the first few buildings of Futarasan, and heading towards the Bacatoro. In the dim light, he could just make out the sword mark S on its frame. Someone was nearby, seen in shadow. A robed man. That man was about to light the lantern. Wife San coughed loudly in her sleep, breaking the reverie. The cold, plain walls of the bedroom were again visible in the moonlight. His mountains had disappeared, but something from the vision had remained, an obstinate sense of a presence. The atmosphere felt murky around him. He blankets oppressive. He shook free of the heaviest of them and turned to look at wife San. Her sleeping face seemed strange again, somehow distorted. He moved to get a closer look and felt his hair stand on end. The face he gazed upon was not the face of his wife, but that of some incomprehensible, ghastly being. It opened its eyes, lunging up through the darkness. He landed on his feet and slapped on the overhead light. There lay beautiful wife San again. Her eyelids tightened as she turned over on her side. He turned the light back off and went next door to read. In his den, several hours later, he awoke in the sofa, his neck aching. He headed downstairs to get ready for work. Before preparing his usual breakfast of toast and coffee, he went to the washroom for a quick shave in the dirty mirror. Walking to the train station, he reflected on what he had seen. Up close had been the test. In the dark, wife San's face had seemed fluid, evil. Then in the light, she had appeared normal again. Now here he was heading to work in the early dawn, trying to convince himself it had all just been his overexcited imagination. He caught the rapid train as usual and found a good seat. On the 20-minute ride, he stared at the pretty face of a young passenger who was intently reading a magazine. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his gaze, her eyes startled him terribly. That night he found himself near the Bacatoro again. It was more real than sleeping, more real than his room. The robed man stood nearby, glaring at him with dull, triangular eyes. Mark turned away from the robed man and looked down at his own arm of copper, counting 10 sword marks, the sudden reflection of a flame over th. Oath marks mesmerized him. Then someone coughed, waking him back into reality under the blankets. His gaze fell upon wife San's fluid face. It was changing again. The sight was unspeakably real, but he didn't try to rub his eyes. Her face morphed through a rapid succession of hideous animal appearances. Confusion became terror. He turned away and tried to focus on the moonlight which Sinkoa lest into a cloud of mist. And all he perceived that something was trying to enter the room through that mist. He fought desperately to move, to get up, but his body would not respond. He opened his mouth to scream, but the pathetic muted sounds he voiced were the incoherent mutterings of a baby. As though by some invisible force, his body vaulted upright all at once, and he came face to face with an evil, triangular head which somehow bore 3 distinct faces, each vying for space in dark shades of gray. They spoke to him in unison, alien tongues. Wife San cried out. She could hear pained mutterings nearby in the dark, and some deeper voice as well. WHHWH, who is? She began to ask, but her mouth refused to complete the sounds. Presently there came a violent thrashing of limbs and blankets. Fighting a burst of pure terror, she lunged for the light switch. Wife San gazed down helplessly upon the convulsing body of her husband, and his arms were flailing in unison, his hands gripping together as though wielding some invisible weapon. She called out to him, got down on her knees, and shook him, and screamed his name, but he could not hear her calling. To him he would never hear earthly sound again. Story 3. Rugrat's theory. The Rugrats really were a figment of Angelica's demonic and able imagination. Chucky died in 1986 along with his mother. That's why Ches is a nervous wreck all the time. Tommy was born in 1988, but he was stillborn. That's why Stu's constant lie in the basement making toys for the son who never had a chance to live. The DeVillies had an abortion in 1990. Angelica couldn't figure whether it would be a boy or a girl, thus creating the twins as if, or all grown up, the teenage Angelica became addicted to various narcotics which further aggravated her schizophrenia, bringing her back to her childhood and thus the creations she obsessed over because of elapsed between the present and the last time she interacted with her creations. She made them older. Angelica was constantly taking hits of acid, so she would never have to live without her creations who were her only company. In a judgmental world, Angelica's mom actually died of a heroin overdose in 1980, just after Angelica was born, and drew in his depression. Right, a gold-digging whore that Angelica idolized because she fooled herself into thinking it was her real mom, but always had a concept of her mom, Cynthia, and took a Barbie doll and made it after her mom's image, wearing an unwashed orange dress and having jacked up hair, which is why she was so attached to it. Later in life, she followed in her mom's footsteps with drugs and everything. She, dying of an overdose at age 13, when all grown up, was cancelled. The only Rugrat not to be fictional, however, was unborn Tommy's brother Dill. However, Angelica didn't know the difference between Dill and her creations. although Dill didn't follow her commands. After endless crying and a refusal to disappear like the others did when Angelica was angry with them, she hit him. Due to this, he sustained a brain hemorrhage, which resulted in a deformation. As he grew up, his damage only became more evident, and by the time he was 9 and all grown up, he lived as an outcast, being ridiculed for his weirdness and retardation. The immense guilt over this is what led Angelica to her drug use, and is what led Angelica to uncreate the Rugrats briefly until her experience with HALUCINOGENICS on a trip to Paris to find love. Ches married a woman named Kira. He was actually going to marry a different woman named Coco, but she just wanted him for his money. Ho had a daughter named Kimmy that was torn from her because she was a cocaine addict. Angelica imagined her from Kira's stories. He lost his mind after the death of his wife and was in denial that she was ever a prostitute. Upon return to America, Ches and Kira married, and she got her green card. It was actually a really happy and romantic story. Kira continually struggled with addiction, but was relatively happy with her life, and Ches, Susie, was actually Angelica's only friend who entertained the thought of Angelica's creations. For her sake, Angelica spent the last days of her life in the back of the school cafeteria, imagining friends around her and playing with the lives of her creations. The Rugrats really were a figment of Angelica's imagination. Chucky died a long time ago along with his mother. That's why Ches is a nervous wreck all the time. Tommy was stillborn. That's why Stu is constantly in the basement making toys for the son who never had a chance to live. The DeVillies had an abortion. Angelica couldn't figure whether it would be a boy or a girl, thus creating the twins. As for all grown up, Angel Ika was a bipolar schizophrenic who, as a teenager, became addicted to various narcotics, bringing her back to her childhood, thus creating a world in her mind that she obsessed over because of the time lapse between the present and the last time she interacted with her imaginary world. She made them older. Angelica was constantly taking hits of acid so she would never have to live without her creations. To her, her creations were her only company in a judgmental world. Angelica's mom actually died of a heroin overdose. Angelica was schizophrenic and bipolar because she was a crack baby. Addition. Eli Drew, in his depression, married a gold-digging whore that Angelica idolized because she fooled herself into thinking it was her real mom. However, she always had a concept of her mom. Cynthia. She used a Barbie doll to mirror her birth mother's image, wearing an unwashed orange dress and jacked up hair, which is why she was so attached to it. Later in life, she followed in her mother's footsteps, dying of an overdose at age 13 when All Grown Up was cancelled. The only Rugrat not to be fictional, however, was unborn Tommy's brother, Dill. However, Angelica didn't know the difference between Dill and her creations. Dill didn't follow her commands, and after endless crying and a refusal to disappear like the others did when Angelica was angry with them, so she hit him. After she hit him, he screamed a screeching tune, and Stu ran in and pulled his niece off of his only child. But it was too late. Dill had a brain hemorrhage, which resulted in a deformation. As he grew up, his damage only became more evident, and by the time he was 9 and all grown up, he lived as an outcast, being ridiculed for his weirdness and retardation. The immense guilt over this is what caused Angelica to start using drugs and to uncreate the Rugrats briefly until her experience with hallucinogenics. Ches lost his mind after the death of his first wife and was in denial that she was ever a prostitute. On a trip to Paris to find love, Ches fell in love with a hooker named Kira. He was originally going to marry a different hooker, but she just wanted him for his money. Kira once had a daughter named Kemi, but the baby was torn from her by law due to her cocaine addiction. Angelica imagined Kemi from Kira's stories. Upon return to America, Ches and Kira married, and she got her green card. It was a surprisingly happy and romantic story. Kira continually struggled with addiction, but was relatively happy with her new life with Chaz Susie. He was Angelica's only friend who entertained the thought of Angelica's creations because they seemed to make her happy. She later became a psychologist and teamed up with Nickelodeon to make the Rugrats when Angelica died of the overdose. Susie helped arrange her funeral because of her addictions and her mental state. Angelica was expelled from society, which led to a break with Rio. In her eventual death, she spent the last days of her life in the back of the school cafeteria, imagining friends around her and playing with the lives of her creations. Story 4. Donkey Lady. This is another entry in the Modern Monsters series, so I heard you wanted to hear the story of the Donkey Lady. Well, grab a beer, you're in for a tale. It started back in the 80s in a little town outside of San Antonio, Texas. I was a senior in high school back just after moving out of the worst school I'd ever been to in my life. Ever since the incident with a kid named Larry, I just had to leave then. This town was much better. Well, most of the time anyway. Living in this town was a girl named Maria. We didn't know each other very well. Never talked much, but we didn't hate each other either. She had a long face and crazy buck teeth. One of her flaws was her stubbornness and lack of hindsight. She always saw the best in people even when it wasn't there. One example of this was when she married to a guy named Tyrone. Huge brute of a guy, a thug even. He abused her and drank a lot, and yet she was still madly in love with him, even though a couple of drinks for herself always helped keep this loyalty alive. Everyone in town knew. The police just couldn't find enough evidence to ever convict him or make her change her mind. It was just a dirty little secret to this town, almost like finding a huge wad of cash in a bush, a skeleton in the closet. Nobody has to know. They eventually had 2 kids, the older W to 5 and the younger to 3. No children at that age should have to endure this kind of parenting. I only ever saw them once or twice, but their eyes, for the love of God, their eyes, they went, dug into my soul. They had a look to them, like they had seen things they didn't want to see, heard things they didn't want to hear, been things they didn't want to be. Eventually, during a drunken rampage, Tyrone burned down the house and trapped the entire family inside. That was a horrific night. The flames slowly consumed the house, and the faint cry of children, and the grotesque cry of Maria. It sounded like a wild horse getting put down. We all stood outside, waiting for the ambulance. screaming support and for help. Nothing we could do. Maria had barely managed to escape herself, and according to the police, whatever was left of Tyrone had been dead just earlier than the fire. We all visited her in the hospital with flowers and gifts. We nearly puked when we saw her, and you may think that's an over-exaggeration, but the fire had deformed her greatly. Her hands had fused together, leaving a revolting little gap in the middle, and even looky, a little like hooves. Her skin loosened. It dangled under her eyes and aged her by 100 years, and it was as pale as the moon. Her hair had turned gray and lifeless. It gave her the appearance of a monster or a mule. I'd sat next to her for a second, telling her we were all sorry for what had happened to her, and then she turned her head around to face me, and my heart sank. Her terrifying features were close up, and she gave me a look of such pure contempt and hate for humanity, a look that made her hate the human race's very existence. Her eyes hair surrounded by black, and they looked at me with a look of hatred and even sarcasm. Seriously, Maria, we honestly are, I said, trying to reassure her. We'll see. We'll see, she faintly mumbled. She barely sounded human. She barely was human. We left then, and so did our hope Maria would never be the same again. Fast forward to about 5 years later, and Maria had moved away a long time ago, or at least we assume she moved away. We never heard from her again, and she was nowhere to be seen. A couple buddies and I went driving to the old Hickory Bridge. That's what we called it back in those days, before the next incident. We were pissed drunk, drinking and honking our buddy's car horn. The horn sounded like a donkey guffawing wildly, sounds like a freaking jackass. I chuckle grudgingly. Maria, you mean, of course, my friend has replied. In any other circumstances, that would have been offensive and cruel, but when drunk, of course, I found it damn hilarious. Dude, I'm serious, he continued. She looked like a freaking donkey. I heard the horn again, except this time it seemed louder and had a bit more tempo, like was more natural. Man, stop screwing around with the horn. That wasn't me, man. It went silent then, and the mood changed. It had went too funny, too indescribably eerie. Then, in a moment of realization, we looked out the windshield. Some eyes appeared from the darkness. Those eyes are indescribably horrible, glaring yellow orbs glaring from the shadow, giving a look of pure hatred and madness. Suddenly, some mule-like creature pounded on our roof, giving a look of an animal, but a slight sense of humanity to it. It smashed the windshield, and we screamed until our voices were hoarse. The beast was screaming with a rage about its lovelies, how she lost them to a demon, and raging about a flame. Then it strode off on all fours. It was all very rushed and seemed to be over in a second, and it left us in awe and suspense. The meaning of the creature's rant had flown right over my head at the time. The beast fled over the bridge and back into the woods. A day later, one of the more fearless and stubborn guys went out with a .22 to take care of whatever attacked us. After we went back to town, when we thought it was safe, we warned him to be careful, and I guess we didn't warn him enough. He was never seen again. From then on, we called it the Donkey Lady Bridge, and try our best to keep this to ourselves. After a few others were found dead their W as an attempt to destroy it, but the destruction crew were found dead and mutilated. And the problem is the forensic crew said there was no way that one thing could have killed them, and that it must have had help from about two beings that seemed to leave the same traces as the main creature, but seemed much smaller, almost like to offspring. So there you go. I bet you're glad you heard it now. Sweet dreams. Story 5, Snowscape. It's been a while since I had anything like human contact, so I'll attempt to be as brief as I can, at least. The sound of typing is noise, and the echoes it produces are the nearest thing to a reply I've had in months. I lost my job back in August. The dollar's dropping. The economy's poor, and as on you just aren't a competitive investment anymore. I'm young and I don't have bills, so I took it in stride. The days of day zero closure notices and no parachutes were stories I'd only heard from my dearest relatives, and besides, it's hard to feel betrayed when you grow up learning these things really are only business. I collected my generous severance and decided to take a week off or so. A few years of being on call made me appreciate the value of a vacation, whatever form it was in, and my girlfriend and I had our savings. Like any self-respecting nerd, the week quickly became a blur of pizza orders every 2 days, progressing day by day into a persona I now only encounter during the blurry hours just before I slept and just after I woke. A week became 2 weeks, then a month. Slowly the creaks and groans and occasionally startling shuffles of the old apartment building he lived in lost their frightening nature. I'd always been the horror junkie, and I suppose my jaded nature made such assimilations much more graceful. In time, even the intermittently flickering street lights and faint chatter, or the distant television's conversations, apparitions, or whatever existed in the building became more reassuring than unsettlings. I even began to fancy the old stain in the bathroom linoleum, which the landlord swore was wine and I believe was blood, had begun to fade like you'd expect from any nocturnal, unemployed gamer. My relationship with my girlfriend quickly went downhill. Our infrequent conversations grew more heated and then more frigid, an affair of pauses and token acknowledgments. She started going out more. After a while, she stopped coming home more. After that, she stopped coming home at all. I barely noticed I'd done. Think I noticed much of anything at that point. The days blurred more, and I could rarely remember if I had eaten, when I had woken, or how long I had been like this. I began to forget what the daytime really seemed like. Even the struggling blue-gray of dawn and dusk receded as the winter set in. Days became measured in a succession of the flickering street light, sick yellow sodium arc. After a while I began to notice a distinct absence in the air. The times I did come to enough to remember to shower or eat, I was drowned in the smell of the building collection of garbage bags in the kitchen, and the sullen stillness of the white courtyard beneath my windows. I often wondered how it could have so little snow, barely 6 inches, at any time, yet never display a single footstep to or from the darkened windows. At least, I'd think the neighbors were quiet. Even the nocturnal whispers from the ducting had seemed to grow muted and fade, until I no longer could distinguish them from the gentle hum of the building's innards After maybe the fourth or fifth time I experienced these moments of clarity, I resolved to remove the trash. The small had faded from sharp to mute, a sweet and musty reminder of life amidst the sharp winter air leaking in through the ill-maintained windows. It repulsed me with some effort. I gathered as many bags as I could and struggled through door after door. I winced at every bang and crash at the door, with no leaking sounds of televisions. Theft I had nothing to gauge my racket, and every moment seemed to tear at the till air of the building around. Then I noticed I could see my breath, though I did not feel any colder than normal. After an eternity pushing through the empty hallways, I pushed through the front door of the building into the cutting air outside. A low, constant hum echoed off the snow as the wind pushed over the undisturbed snow cover all about me, forming an inch-high mist of blowing grains, tumbling and twisting over the dunes which had formed on the adjacent parking lot, piling on the doors of the various stores which lined the streets. I briefly wondered how bad the weather had been lately to push the life out of city so thoroughly, then pushed my way down what memory served was the sidewalk, keeping to the edge of the building like it was a life tethered by a forgotten habit, and perhaps a morbid curiosity of what other humans looked like. I strained to see through each mirror-like window for signs of movement or habitation. What blinds were drawn displayed vacant apartments, tinfoil to block the sun, the occasional poorly placed shelf or couch. Not a single shuffle or bustle escaped into the vacuous winter atmosphere. I rounded the corner to the back alley to find the hulking form of a garbage truck in the alley, laden with snow and ice, until it seemed more an ancient monument to the cold than a sign of civilization. It should have seemed unsettling to me, but by then I was so eager to abandon the icy landscape to the relative warming tones of my monitor's glow. My only thought was to drop the garbage off and set back inside my apartment. I rushed down its length and in front of it, ready to throw the bags overhand into the dumpster, when I was stopped by the only light to emanate from the cab of the truck, the rapidly scrolling digits of a radio scanner visible through the open door of the cab, pushing its tenuous glow on a clipboard and pen. Abandoning my garbage, I lifted myself into the cab and attempted to read from the frost-bound paragraphs tightly wound over the paper near the bottom, ink blurred by its inability to set in what must have been well-frozen paper at the time was scrawl for W. Eeks now, even the radios have gone quiet. -67°C last time a station got through. Gas froze last night. Need to find someone. I looked back up, down the alley, across the snowscape of parking lots and buildings being swallowed by snow, and listened hard to the howl of ice over ice. I tried to imagine wolves or mocking voices or anything from the hellscapes of the stories I had studied so thoroughly, but the tone never changed, never let up or grew louder. It's a lonely place, missing the end of the world. Story 6. The Galleried Father. Forgive me, for I have sinned. I never had taste for art, but sometimes you get an invite to the finest gallery you could ever be invited to. Free food, rich women, cheap security, and expensive art. The whole situation was fantastic for a skilled ne'er-do-well such as myself. I was to walk in. They never were. I should have known. My first major realization after walking into the gallery was its emptiness. Nobody was in there, and here were no traces of people putting the art up. The walls were painted a bright red that took a second for my eyes to adjust to. There were 7 sculptures total that lead to a great white sea canvas at the end of the room. The sculptures weren't covered or shielded. There was no glass or security. I should have walked out when I saw that stealing the art would be an issue, but instead I just observed the art, thinking that I could cart 1 or 2 of the smaller sculptures out of the building and into my truck. Now I know that wasn't going to happen. The first sculpture, as of a woman, she would have been beautiful, but she had been ruined. She had scars from surgery and violent acts. She had a pale purple makeup dusted along her body, and her mascara was running down her cheeks. She was practically nude and had a frightening sexuality about her. She reminded me of a girl that I knew in Chicago. She was a prostitute and died a few months ago when she was at her most desperate. A man picked her up, and I never saw her again. Poor girl, she might have been the best deal in all of Chicago. The second sculpture was a very fat man. He was covered in even more surgical scars. They were in places where you would expect for a weight removal operation. Whatever operation the artist attempted to portray had failed the fat guy. He was nearly bursting at he seams and the staples of his scars. A soapy fat substance dripped onto the floor. I think he looked a little like me. I mean, I'd been called fat before, and maybe I was, but I never reached this level. I stole food when didn't need it from those who did for sport, and I ate whatever I had. Maybe the fat guy is more like me than I could imagine. The third was even stranger. It was an old man who was also quite bloated, but this time from a different substance. He wore a crown and jewels, but most of his riches were inside of his body. He was cut up and gold, and jewelry was stuffed into his slots like a piggy bank. His skin had a rotted gold hue, and the gold sometimes bled out from his wounds. This man looked more like me. I was happiest with this sculptor, though it seemed like I could have reached inside of his stomach and took a handful of riches with me. I might be able to run from everything if I stole his crown or coins. The next sculpture was of a very thin man. He was legless, and his waist concluded with the odd withering tail forming around his spinal column. He was sat upright against a chair and looked blankly at me. I couldn't help compare myself to this deathly inactive being, as I never help anybody other than myself. I stood by and watched good people die, and I never have done anything that hadn't benefited me. I'm sure the poor sucker represented here never did anything for anybody either. The next one was very difficult to compare to any human figure. It had large eyes spread across its body, staring low and gingly at the other sculptures. It seemed like it had only characteristics depicting of the other works of art, as if its only goal was to become what it saw. I was very much like this sculpture. I have always looked at richer men in hatred. Maybe that's what leads me to steal from them. I show them that I am better and richer, and I leave them poor and damaged. They always deserve it. The next sculpture was maybe the most disgusting. It looked as if it could have resembled myself or someone I knew, if not for the horrible disfigurements on it. It was painted a bright red and seeped blood from its many injuries. These injuries meant that it would be impossible to steal this sculpture, because along the sculpture's large muscular body were razors, blades, and nails stuck out, ward towards me. If I grabbed it anywhere, I would be cut or stabbed by its violent being. I saw myself in this one too, though I have always been violent and volatile to my fellow man. I get the largest share in a partnership where someone suffers. People who work with me might happen to end up dead. I realized who it looked like. It looked like Jimmy from Boston. I slit his throat with a razor and nailed him onto wall where his blood would drip. He got what was coming to him, though. He attempted to take a 50% share. Then the idiot tried to threaten me. The last one was odd in comparison to the others. It was a very attractive man cast in bronze. There was less horror involved, save for one thing. It looked exactly like me. He was placed on a pedestal above every other sculpture and shined bronze, so bright and separate from the red on the walls of the gallery. I think I like this one the most. I just might steal it and keep it for himself. A man as skilled as myself deserves only the best, and this is the best I've seen, and it looks a lot like me. One piece of art still remained, a large white canvas draped on the floor and wall of the back of the gallery. I decided that it was worthless. While it was blank and turned around to leave, I was stopped, though. Every sculpture disappeared from their placement. I was frightened and shocked. I ran for the door in haste, but I was knocked down. I woke up at the canvas. I looked away from it to see the sculptures coming towards me. I was the last piece of art, a great mural, painted in sinner's blood. Now I lay here, torn piece by piece, a monument to all great sins. No God can hear me repent, no matter how loud I screamed. Story 7. No. Shortly after turning 12, my family moved to a much larger, albeit older, house. I had my choice of 3 bedrooms. Being oldest does have its perks, and resolve to bunker down in the basement. This decision was based on isolation and being able to hear my parents come downstairs. The walk-in closet was just an added bonus. I developed a habit of leaving my bedroom spotless and inflicting all of my chaotic nature within the confines of the walk-in closet. Legos, action figures, even a small assortment of black and white 70s pornography pamphlets became scattered in what I would describe as a pubescent fortress. At one point, my younger brother and I nearly burned down a barn. The consequences of this action were the removal and destruction of all toys we had. Naturally, some of the things found in my closet prompted a stern conversation. And 3 months of being grounded to my room, the only time I was permitted to leave the house was with a parent or to attend school. For someone that age to have their belongings stolen away and kept in a nearly empty room for extended periods of time, I can assure you it requires a great deal of medication or an imagination to remain sane. I had the luxury of both. At some point my mother took pity on my hermit-like plight and brought me along for some yard sale adventures. I had no money, and to be honest, it was odd to be around people I did not know. I gave them ample space. At some point while performing this awkward dance, my shin met a firm object jutting out slightly under one of the sale tables. It was a small computer, an inch at all. In one apple, I pointed this find out, and the shabby system fell into my possession courtesy of my mother. The system was accompanied by a small, feathered box full of discs and cables, most of which were not usable. I took my time erecting a shrine in the closet to house my treasure. Milk cartons and overly discovered Where's Waldo books served as the frame for my makeshift desk. I paused, admire the system, and jabbed my finger at the power button. A fan somewhere within its guts growled to life and gradually sank into a purr of white noise. The screen, however, remained blank. My heart sank, and I waited anxiously for several minutes before giving up. My technical know-how was far from adequate to revive the patient, so I left the hunched system humming to itself and embedded the rest of my evening with reading and homework. The sun gradually bled behind the mountains and disappeared, signaling it was time for bed. My parents' sleep schedule was enforced heavily. They always slept well in the dark. The darkness has had a calming effect on me, and I think part of that stems from being the eldest and not being terrorized. One thing that does upset my sleep in any situation is light. Perhaps I have thin eyelids. Perhaps I open my eyes when I dream. Regardless, I found my eyes flickering open towards the source of my unwanted illumination. Consciousness rega, ined with increasing puzzlement at what I saw. The closet door was closed, but a distinct green hue snuck out from under it. The brightness was increasing and decreasing at random intervals, pandering to my curiosity. I rose from bed and shuffled slowly towards the closet. I was barely conscious enough to evade the mess of books and homework debris. Before my hand touched the cold knob, I knew what to suspect. The door opened to reveal a working computer with a monotone display. The screensaver looked like pixels attempting to eat one another. I would later learn that it was called life. The screensaver. That night I set aside the urge to sleep and explored the storage of my newfound source of entertainment. One night of sleeplessness turned into several. I was excited every to feign my slumber until the shuffling upstairs would die out, to dive into my closet to entertain myself. Faceless floppies would yield games, books, papers, pictures, and even a few nudes. I was approaching 15 games, and the box still had a large supply of discs to go. I found a word program that allowed me to keep a diary, a drawing tool to make simple sketches, and other useful things to occupy my time. For someone who had access to such a thing only during school time, this was fantastic. School became a blur of daydreams and naps. I quickly adjusted to my new nocturnal obsession. 5 weeks into my 3 months of being grounded, I slowly grew aware of a numb feeling. I no longer felt despair in secluding myself. I could go days without more than a few sentences uttered, and found the void of communication being swallowed up by my diary and the pictures I drew. Thursday night that week I plopped down in front of the green screen and fumbled in the dark for more discs inside the frail computer box. This disc was different from the rest in that it was marked null in large black permanent swatches. After about a minute of loading, the screen began to shift and contort in ways I thought impossible. My mind noted the swirls and the title artichoke before a swift blackness fell over me. I could hear a high-pitched squeal sounding from somewhere. My initial thought was that the computer display had finally died. I stood on my feet, wobbled, and held the doorknob to the exit from my closet for a few moments. I found myself standing in a room filled with natural sunlight. The window well allowed just enough sunlight to spill through my blinds and cast shadowy stripes over everything. Puzzled, I made my way upstairs and joined my family for dinner. What's with the PJs? I blink up at my father and muster a weak shrug. Dinner is ready. Go find your brother dinner, I question. Weakly, he nods and returns his attention back to the news. Rocking in his slick leather chair, I turn to go upstairs and instead take a slight right, heading back to my room. I push open the door and beeline to the ajar closet door and fling it open. The action required to throw open a door drains me significantly. I stand in the doorway staring down at an empty patch of carpet where the computer once sat. No box, no discs, no computer. I later learned over dinner that I've somehow lost a month of awareness. Both my dogs have died, and my grades are beyond salvage. I've asked my father about e-computer on several occasions, and every time he comments how I walked out with it one day and returned a couple hours later minus the system and barefoot. Of course, I cannot recall a single bloody thing he claims